To many Protestants, monasticism, monks, nuns, hermits, the whole thing just seems really weird. It's alien and unsettling and viewed with not completely unjustified suspicion. But the reality is that to understand church history, you need to understand the history of monasticism. From the 4th century onwards, the heart of the church spiritually and the mind of the church theologically would be driven, in general, by monastics. You can't understand the split of East and West between Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholicism unless you understand something of the growing division over their views of the end goal and purpose of the monastic life. You can't understand the Reformation, why it happened, when it happened, where it happened, to who it happened, without grasping something of monasticism. Martin Luther was, after all, a monk. So, thinking about early monasticism, we need to start with a few hopefully familiar names. You might recall that through the first 3 centuries of persecution by the Roman state, there were groups of Christians who were of the, how shall we say, hotter variety, more purist, stricter in their views on Christian life, on who could be accepted as a Christian and who could not, of what to do with people who repented of being a Christian before the state, who apostatized and became pagan once more, but then wanted back into the church. They would have very strong views on not allowing such things. Then there were those in the church who had the more generous expectations, the more pragmatic approach than these more zealous ones. But also think back to another thing we've mentioned before with someone like Origen, that remarkable but rather extreme theologian from Egypt who castrated himself to avoid sin, who went barefoot everywhere, who only owned a single cloak, who didn't drink alcohol, who lived as a vegetarian and fasted for long periods of time. These hotter-headed, more zealous groups, and the likes of Origen with this aesthetic practice of denying the body, were the breeding grounds of what would later become known as monasticism. And the purpose of monasticism likewise changed as the context and culture around the church likewise came to change. Now, it's popularly believed that Anthony the Great was the first monastic, but this is patently not true because he was inspired to become a hermit, to become a monastic, by his visiting people who were already living in the wilderness. But in general, he is a good place to start. Yet before getting to him, I do want to take one further step back and look at the 2 different centres of early monasticism, and they should be quite familiar with us. The first one is Syria, centred around Antioch, and the second one is Egypt, centred around Alexandria. And the reasons why people embraced being monks or nuns in Syria and in Egypt, the primary reasons were different, although they did have a lot of crossover as well. So in Syria, the main reason for moving into the desert away from society was primarily physical survival. Persecution by the Roman state was quite severe, but it was nothing compared to what the Persian Sassanid Empire did to Christians. And in the face of such great persecution, Christians had to flee from centres of civilization and live on the fringes of society. And when you're faced with such persecution, it makes sense that it is the people who have the hotter, the purer, more zealous faith who actually remain Christian. There's no point half-assing something when it's going to cost you not just everything you own, but potentially even your life. And so fleeing persecution was the main cause for the beginning of monasticism and living in the wilderness in Syria. But it was combined secondarily with something else, which was an increasingly growing influence by the fastly growing cult of Manichaeism, which was a cult that rose to popularity in the mainly Zoroastrian Sassanid Empire. And Manichaeism, it revered Zoroaster and Buddha and Jesus as prophets, but they saw an individual named Mani as the ultimate and final prophet sent by God. That kind of line of the ultimate final prophet sent by God sounds a bit familiar to another major world religion today. And Manichaeism would spread across the ancient world from Rome in the west to China in the east. It was one of the most widespread ancient religions. And key to our story of Christian monasticism was that Manichaeism was very what we call dualistic. It was a dualistic faith. There is light and there is dark. There is the God of goodness and light and the God of darkness and evil, who are equally powerful, and everything in creation, everything that exists, is in one of these two spheres of influence: light or dark, good or bad. And as far as they're concerned, the body, the human body, the flesh, the world, society, all of these things are firmly in the dark, evil, corrupt camp. And thus, if light is to win in your life, that you might achieve salvation, you need to suppress the darkness of the body and its fleshy urges and desires, and embrace a life of self-denial, known as Aestheticism. Now, this is very unbiblical, because in the Bible, the body is the temple of the living God. It's a good thing. All of creation, God declared good. But this kind of radical self-denial of the body crept in as the monks in Syria fled persecution. In Egypt, persecution was also a factor, persecution by the Roman Empire, but not as great as it was in Syria. And because it wasn't so great there, it's in Egypt that the basic models and purposes of what we would recognise today as monasticism began to be clearly formed and normalised. In Egypt, the primary purpose of withdrawing to live the life of a solitary monk, a solitary ascetic, was much more to do with the popular teaching of Gnosticism. Now, Gnosticism, you may remember, is a heresy. It's not Christian, it's false teaching. But like Manichaeism, Gnosticism taught that all of creation had a dual nature. There was light and there was dark, and the flesh and the body and its desires are dark and evil. The flesh is to be escaped if you are to attain to the truth. The body is a prison that you need to break out from with your soul if you are to find enlightenment. Spiritual progress is only possible as the body is increasingly devalued and crushed and abused. And Gnosticism was clearly a heresy, but in Egypt its influence on the church was stronger than anywhere else. It's not a coincidence that the largest collection of Gnostic texts, both Christian-influenced Gnostic ones and completely stonk-raving mad ones, were found in an Egyptian monastery. And so, following this philosophy of Gnosticism and looking in the Bible to people like John the Baptist who did live in the wilderness, individuals, especially in the south of Egypt, began to withdraw from society and live alone. And the most significant of these was Anthony the Great, who lived from 251 to 356 AD. 251 to 356 AD. At about the age of 20, he sold all that he had and gave it to the poor, and then he went into the desert to learn from other hermits. A hermit is a monk who lives on their own, and the word hermit actually comes from the Greek word eremos, which means wilderness. Anthony, he ate only bread and salt and water once a day, although fasting for many days on the trot was quite common, and it's said that he battled the demons of temptation both mentally, spiritually and even physically in the desert. And he became more and more popular, and more people flocked to hear from him and his wisdom. And this led him to seek more and more remote places to live. Eventually he even settled in an abandoned Roman fort where he locked it all down, so the only way that food could get to him was when it was thrown over the wall for him. Eventually this wasn't enough, and so he set up on a small island in the Nile so that people could come and hear his wisdom and insight, but he was also nicely separate as well. But he wasn't completely always outside of society. For example, when persecution hit under Diocletian, he visited Alexandria, the great city, that he might give encouragement to the Christians who were in prison. And what's interesting about Anthony is that he caught the attention of the most famous of theologians, Athanasius of Alexandria, a legendary theologian who combated Arianism and helped to establish the Nicene Creed. And this is significant that he caught the attention of Athanasius, because you see, unlike with Buddhism, the success of monasticism in Christianity was not written on stone. It isn't actually a natural fit. You see, there's two things at play here. On the one hand, as time went on, the church became increasingly centralized around bishops. It became hierarchical, and the focus of worship and the spiritual life became the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, overseen, of course, by the bishop. And these bishops became more and more powerful, with more and more political weight behind them. And the Constantine conversion, well, this just made the monastics more dangerous. The bishops wanted the power, but here were the monastics. They were outside the normal workings of the church. They were popular spiritual leaders. They were a clear threat. Their way of life was not focused on the teaching of the bishop. Their view of how you became spiritual and a good Christian was not focused on the bishop and the Lord's Supper. It was on prayer and fasting and the private life. They rejected the power and the prestige of the bishops, and thus they threatened the very foundations of those who benefited most from that power and prestige. So there was definitely a political power struggle at play that could easily have quashed monasticism. But there was also, of course, the biblical issues behind this. The Bible is very positive about the human body being a temple. Physical creation is a good thing. We don't want to escape our physical bodies. We want to have resurrection bodies. We want to redeem society, not escape society. There's very few examples in Scripture of anyone living a long-term monastic life apart from probably John the Baptist. There's no examples in the Acts of the Apostles. There's no examples in the very early years of the church either. And thus monasticism could easily have remained a fringe part of the faith. But Athanasius was the pinnacle of the early church in so many ways, and he wrote what is called a hagiography, which is a biography of the virtues of a saint. A saint is a holy person, or a hagios, and so you have hagi, holy, ography, the hagiography, the holy writing. He wrote a hagiography about Anthony, which promoted Anthony as a remarkable man in so many ways that we should all follow. And this book became probably his bestseller. Indeed, it was widely translated as well. And in no small part due to the influence of this book, the survival and the thriving of monasticism was guaranteed, because Athanasius gave it his stamp of approval as the bishop, as the champion of the Nicene Church. Countless people flocked to the wilderness to follow in the footsteps of Anthony, such that the desert became known as a city of monks. But living alone as a hermit is tough, and it's not the only way. One contemporary of Anthony was a Roman soldier called Pachomius the Great. Anthony the Great, Pachomius the Great. Are you seeing a follow-on with this title of the greatness of monasticism? Pachomius the Great joined the Roman army not by choice, he was forced in, but during his time there he saw firsthand the love and the charity of Christians, and he decided upon leaving the army he would seek out Christians to learn more, which he did, and he was baptized in 314 AD, and he sought out in the Egyptian wilderness hermits for wisdom, including Anthony. But he was influenced more than anything also by the regimented and communal nature of the Roman legions, the Roman army, and so he took the step of creating the first real monastic communities, collections of monks living together to support one each other in their efforts. And his first monastery, which he established around 320 AD, quickly gathered more than 100 monks. And being a Roman soldier, of course, he set up structures by which monks would live by under an abbot or an abbess, a hierarchy by which to live. And of course, being a Roman legionnaire, he loved the idea of rules. And so he went about creating a written rule of life, a rule of life that he and his followers would live by, set prayers, set times for services, set times for balancing the practical work of life with prayer, a communal aspect of life, as well as times of solitude. And this rule of life, and Pachomius himself, was highly influential upon someone we've also met, Basil the Great. Once again, the Great is associated with monasticism. And Basil the Great was a bishop, but also a monk. And he established many monasteries, especially around himself, and he finally set the precedent of a common rule of life as the basis for which you would live by as a monk. He based it on Pachomius, but he codified it more, and ultimately all forms of monasticism, both in the Eastern Orthodox Church and in the Western Church, are based on the writings of Basil the Great. But more on that next week. So, we've thus far seen in Egypt the emergence of two kinds of monasticism: the hermits following Anthony the Great, and the monasteries following Pachomius the Great and later Basil the Great. Another influential figure worth mentioning is the infamous Simeon the Stylite, or Simeon of the Pillar. Now, he was from Syria, not from Egypt, and he joined a monastery around the age of 14 or 15, around the turn of the century, so about 400 AD. But even at the age of 14-15, he was seen as so extreme and so austere that he was thrown out of the monastery for being disruptive and unsuited to the communal life of a monastery. And so he began living as a hermit, at first in a shed and then in a cave, and he quickly gathered a following due to his dramatic acts of fasting, living in tight enclosed spaces and trying to stand upright on his legs for as long as possible until his legs gave out beneath him. Eventually, as more and more people flocked to him, he wanted to get away even more, and so he found some ruins, and on that ruin was a pillar with an area on top of it he could probably just about make somewhere to live, about a metre square. And so he did, and he stayed on top of this pillar, and people thought, well, that's strange, maybe he has some wisdom. So they'd come to hear his wisdom, so he'd find another pillar that was even taller, and then another pillar, until in the end he ended up on a pillar which was about 60 foot high, with this 1 metre square or so area at the top in which he lived, a rope and pulley system so that food could get up and waste could go down, and a set of ladders going most of the way up so that people could get to him when he wanted and have a private-ish conversation. So he lived this life of solitude on top of this pillar, finally having what he wanted, but he did also preach, and he also gave advice to people who came to him. Like many monks in Syria and elsewhere at that time, although it was radical that he was living on this pillar, he actually became important in the local community as the arbiter of local disputes and the impartial patron of local causes, because civil service wasn't really functioning in the countryside outside of the cities. Seeing this radical way of living on top of a pillar, of course, led others to try and follow in his footsteps. And so we have this unique form of Syrian monasticism based around living on top of pillars. Now, such radical practices, as well as other incredible feats of endurance and self-denial, became increasingly common as the monasteries grew up. Monks would compete against each other to outdo each other in their dedication to a life of self-denial. They would fast for longer and longer. They would live in worse and worse living conditions. They would have worse and worse personal hygiene, to the point that it was seen as wonderful and virtuous to have bugs crawling into your mouth and out your mouth and into your ears as you were listening to people who came to you for spiritual advice. And these communities, as they grew up competing within each other, well, then it spread, because now you've got monasteries in Egypt and Syria and Palestine, and the monks in Egypt want to be holier than the monks in Palestine, and the Palestinian monks want to be holier than the Syrian monks, and this fervour in this zeal just drives them more and more extreme in what Athanasius called the noble contest. All of this in the name of getting closer to God, of course. A famous example of this kind of viewpoint would be Paula of Rome, a widow who founded a joint monastery and nunnery in Bethlehem with a certain Saint Jerome, who we'll meet in a future lecture looking at Bible translations. Paula of Rome would say this: "I must disfigure that face which is contrary to God's commandment, and I have painted with rouge, white lead, and antimony. I must mortify that body which has been given up to many pleasures. I must make up for my long laughter by constant weeping. I must exchange my soft linen and costly silks for rough goat's hair. I, who have pleased my husband and the world in the past, desire now to please Christ." What any of that has to do with the biblical view of pleasing Christ through faith alone is anyone's guess, but it shows the kind of extreme self-degradation and self-denial that these people were putting them through. And women were important in these communities. Women could gain real power and influence by living a life of self-denial and becoming a spiritual leader in this kind of way. And it's around the time of Paula and Simeon of the Stylites that we begin to see the second phase of monasticism really come into work. The time of persecution and the early Gnosticism and Manichaeism has passed. Emperor Theodosius has made Christianity the state religion of the empire in 380 AD, and the church is faced with a new problem called sacralism. Sacralism is the union of the church and the state. The influx of millions and millions of former and in truth still pagans into the church. To be a member of the state, a citizen of the state, is to be a member of the church. And such sacralism naturally breeds its offspring, nominalism, or being a Christian in name, in nom, only. Nominalism and the need to keep the church and the state going naturally breeds a laxity in moral standards, an allowing of grey areas, more leeway given here and there so that life can go on without too much disruption. And so no longer was the issue fleeing into a desert from persecution. Instead, it was fleeing from the so-called Christian society as the only way to live a life which was truer and purer and higher and more spiritual than those who claimed to be Christian in the cities. Through prayer and fasting and isolation and self-degradation, that's the way. The hotter heads of previous generations, people like the Montanists and Hippolytus, they couldn't simply break away from the church anymore because the church is the state. So they had to live and work within the state, be sanctioned by it in some way. And that sanction, of course, was given to monasticism by Athanasius and by Basil. And so these groups of people wanting a purer life, they increasingly say, let's have purity in a communal setting, away from society, where it's only for us who are truly zealous for the Lord, as we see it. And they branch off and they form their monasteries. But after a while, some people in that community, they feel like this hasn't gone far enough and maybe things are getting a bit lax in this monastery. And so they break off for purer and higher things. And then that group of people gets involved in the local community, and the local lord gives it some money to help it establish itself, and then power and prestige comes in. And so some people say, this isn't what we signed up for, and they break away to try and be even purer and freer from the world. And this cycle, this doomed cycle, repeats itself over and over again, until in the West at least, the Reformation comes and breaks the wheel. So, to sum up the big names and movements in early monasticism, monasticism has its beginning in fleeing persecution and also in the more zealous breed of Christianity. And it's influenced by Gnosticism and Manichaeism, which was this idea that the body is somehow evil and you need to escape it through living an austere life. Anthony the Great established hermits living alone as the form of monasticism. Pachomius the Great, well, he was vital in having monasteries as a community kind of life. Athanasius, he was vital, of course, in promoting Anthony and normalizing the movement in the church. Basil the Great, well, he takes Pachomius and he improves it, and he becomes the foundation for all later monasticism. Simeon the Stylite, of course, does his own thing, and Paula of Rome is a great example of how women were finding power and influence in society through being monastics and living this life of great self-degradation and denial. Next week, we will look at how monasticism grew and spread from this early point up to the Reformation, looking at both East and West and what drove them. But a few questions as we close. What aspects of monasticism can you see in the Bible, and what aspects appear to be contrary to Scripture? Given the role of Gnosticism and Manichaeism and how it played into the establishment of monasticism, is the whole movement, in a sense, suspect? Or could it be freed from these roots? Where do we see the tendencies which led to monasticism growing in the first 3 centuries at work in the church today of the past 3 centuries? And finally, does living a life dedicated to the glory of God require, in some sense, living in our own communities away